globalization in a restricted sense as the process
Process
of
creation of a unified
integration of virtually the entire world into a single market and financial network.
World capitalist economy at the end of the Cold War, but you can also describe it in a much broader sense as a historical process of intensified interaction of peoples, cultures, and economies over long periods of time, and increasing density of social interactions at all levels, at global level. In that sense, you could speak of pre-modern globalization, modern globalization, late modern globalization, and current globalization.
So globalization, with the usage of technology and advancements in the 20th century, has been hyperactive. It means that the connections have either gone smaller or increased in frequency and magnitude. Now, when we look at globalization today, we emphasize things like market forces, economy, politics, and government. But what globalization really shows us is that these interactions can also be ideas, people, and other subgroups in which may have not had a political voice before globalization, and the process of globalization has developed in our modern age.
It's going to make the world smaller. Different countries, different economies, and different cultures are getting closer to one another and probably more similar to one another.
Languages and cultures. In this moment with new technologies, it's impossible to keep big differences like in the past. So globalization is just the natural connecting of the people.
Beginning really with the European conquest of the Americas, European capture of most of the trading networks in the Far East and around the Indian Ocean, as well as the Atlantic. We created a single network of communication and transportation with enormous time-space distances contained within it. Going from Europe to China and back via Mexico would have taken maybe 3 years in the 16th century, as opposed to 3 seconds or nanoseconds as it would today. So globalization, I think, is an old phenomenon, perhaps even older still, in that there were previous world systems that connected most of Eurasia, which were centered either in the Middle East or in Central Asia or in China at various moments before 1500.
I think it's probably best to start with late modern globalization and current globalization to get a sense of what we're talking about, because that's the historical time frame that constituted our present and that shapes our perceptions of the world still today.
I have a 17th century text where this writer is saying you can go out the door in the morning and you can find things from anywhere in the world, you know, at the market and so on. So we've always had it, as long as people have lived in cities and been civilized. And so I say for our present period, neoliberal globalization, because it's very different and it's based much more on the free flow of goods, services, and capital in particular. Capital is the big thing, rather than of people, because there's all kinds of obstacles to people being globalized.
But at the same time, globalization is a reordering of the world order. It's a new division of labor that is global. It's changed the division of labor within countries, within cities, and it has reallocated the fates of billions of people. So it is largely an economic phenomenon first, but I think it also has all these other consequences, culturally, politically, which are a little more complex.
I want to try to keep this topic as simple as possible. However, the overlapping fields of study, compounded by cause and effect, human error, and not to mention the overwhelming spheres of influence, create inevitable complexities for the human species. For the remainder of this film, I ask you to please take on a liberal, individualistic point of view. Set aside our nationalities, ethnicities, and group loyalties for once, and allow science to enlighten our realistic, rational mind. By no means am I asking you to forego your religious beliefs or ideologies. I'm asking you to think for yourself for the collective good of the human species. In reality, we're humans before we're Democrats or Republicans, Americans or Europeans. And because if we had no world to live on, then the majority of us likely will cease to exist.
Late modern globalization was the product of the unification of the world by Europe and through European expansion, which led to the creation of a worldwide economy structured between cores, dominant cores, and dominated peripheries, the countries that were colonized by the European powers and that were inserted into a new international division of labor, which was organized around forms of domination and exploitation. You can characterize 19th century globalization as the conjunction of the construction of an unequal world economy, an inegalitarian world economy structured between cores and peripheries, and the simultaneous expansion of certain forms of technology that made this unification of the world economy under European dominance possible. I'm talking about the telegraph, I'm talking about new forms of transportation, and so on and so forth.
So by 1900, you could cross the Atlantic in 7 days, you could get to Australia in 6 weeks, you could communicate information and commodity prices instantaneously over a world telegraph system. So in many ways, what we think of as the traits of the globalization of the late 20th century already are present at the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th. Now what disrupts it, of course, is World War I and World War II. And the fact that with the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia and then later on China were taken out of the world capitalist system and closed off into a kind of separate system.
Late 20th century globalization, there was a long period of interruption. And that long interruption occurred because of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and then the establishment of a divided world, a bipolar world that was divided between the capitalist states led by the United States on the one hand, and the communist world on the other, China, the People's Republic of China, and the Soviet Union. There was a certain form of, there was a world capitalist economy under American leadership during the Cold War, but the world was segmented between the communist world and the non-communist world. And therefore you cannot actually speak of a period of globalization during the Cold War.
So in many ways, if we look at the world of the state of the global economy today, in 2010 or 2013, it looks a lot more like the state of the global economy, say, in 1800 than it does the global economy of 1890. Why? Because in 1800, most of the world's manufacturing was in Asia, not in Europe. And at the end of the 19th century, Asia's share of world manufacturing had dropped dramatically under the impact of their being integrated into trading and imperial systems controlled by the European powers. Here we are, beginning of the 21st century, and certainly Asia is back. But even in Latin America, if you look at the southern market, Mercosur, the center of that market is Brazil, not Europe. And what we're beginning to see is that the trade transactions, the exchanges between countries in the global south are as big or even bigger than their transactions with the old core of the global system as it existed during much of the 19th and 20th century.
So that by the end of the 1990s, you could actually speak of a truly global capitalist economy, still segmented into nation states, of course, but the world economy itself was, for the first time in a very long period of time, truly capitalist. Capitalism had become a truly global phenomenon. People in the United States began speaking of a new golden age of global capitalism. Francis Fukuyama famously wrote in the end of the 1880s, the early 1990s, that the liberal economic and political Western idea had triumphed finally at global level, and so on and so forth. So what you had was a process of global globalization, which was coterminous with the creation of a global capitalist world economy for the first time since the 19th century. That, I think, is the way in which one can understand the economic processes of globalization. There were some spots of the world which were not integrated into that. There was Burma, Myanmar, there's North Korea, of course, but these were exceptions in the overall rule. Globalization, of course, is not only that. Globalization is not merely economics. Globalization is not merely the transnationalization of capital, although, of course, this is a major component of what we understand as globalization. This was facilitated, as in the 19th century, by certain new technologies, the ICT revolution, the information and communications technology revolution, which made the world a much smaller place. So globalization in that way is also the compression of time and space. Right? That's not merely economic, that's technological. Globalization is the growing interaction between various cultures in the process of mixing and hybridization that occurs because of the mixing of culture. So it's not one simple thing. You could generally characterize it as much intensified global interaction, but at the economic level, it's what I've described. It's the creation of a global capitalist world economy.
This is why we must study and analyze globalization in depth, because in my opinion, human beings do not create or control globalization. In my opinion, globalization is a byproduct of human beings' continuous race to further advance their current technologies, to satisfy their biological needs to adapt and evolve. However, this process of human survival, as it continues down the long timeline of history, proves to be unpredictable, contained in considerable risk, unless we can learn to cooperate and work together. The key to survival is cooperation. We must educate ourselves on the facts, in order to learn to work together to ensure human survival, minimize collateral damage and blowback, while striving for global peace and prosperity. In the words of David Marquand, the process known as globalization has increased how information crossed borders and has created many new information channels. Further stating, globalization is a vague concept. Probably its most important manifestation is an increase in international trade and divisions of labor, which has penetrated all but a handful of the world's nations. With that has come increased travel and increased penetration of the developed countries' news media into all parts of the world. So far, the present history of globalization has proven one thing true. The entire world is interconnected in one way or another. Actions that take place on one side of the world will have short and long-term effects in another region of the world. For example, we can see evidence of this after the American financial crisis in 2008, which was largely due to a failure of the market of the credit default swaps and risky banking practices in an unregulated economy. It was inevitable that the bubble would burst, but who would think that the American economy would have a delayed ripple effect on economies abroad? Particularly the 2010 European economic crisis. Under the same theory, we would then lead to believe that these ripple effects do not only apply under economics, but geopolitics, international affairs, and popular culture as well.
Yeah, I think there are no positive or negative phenomenon.
I think globalization is really a positive phenomenon.
I think it's a very positive phenomenon.
I think globalization would be a positive phenomenon.
I definitely think globalization is a positive phenomenon.
I don't think about it in terms of negative and positive. I think is inevitable.
Neoliberalism is an economic theory in which has permeated our society through politics, through law, and even through culture. Neoliberalism refers to the perspective that the government should have little to no involvement in the affairs of economies and of business. This is very different, though, from laissez-faire capitalism in a sense, because neoliberalism believes in the net positive of market actors involved in participating in a particular structure in which there are both governments and non-government actors involved. So we're looking at a structuralization here, a world system, if you will. So neoliberalism is an economic theory that takes advantage of world structures to promote certain advantages to certain groups. There are both winners and losers to neoliberalism.
Getting into a situation where it no longer looks like a positive-sum game, a win-win for everyone. There are going to be winners and losers.
Let's use my adjective, if you don't mind, neoliberal globalization, which means that capital is in the lead, that money is going to be directing this, that finance has fought and won to get absolutely free borders, that it has abolished the rules in the United States in particular on the size of banks, which is one of the things which led directly to the crisis of 2007-2008, which in 2013, where we are now, has still not ended.
So when we talk about neoliberalism, we have to understand that it's an economic theory that has become almost a fundamentalist ideology, because there's no alternative. And whenever you speak that there's no alternative to a particular doctrine, to a particular theory, you become fundamentalist, because you cannot intellectually understand any answers to the problems. Because when you look at the view of the world through one lens, then you are constraining the probabilities of what answers you might come across with. When we look at the disasters of neoliberalism through Bechtel in Bolivia, or Altria Corporation, or Blackwater Group in Iraq, or when we look at people from HSBC to Wells Fargo and laundering billions of dollars in black drug and terrorist money, you start to see that the world, the market actors, the governments, were all interacted in a certain game in which is not really that transparent. And as people, as millennials, that recognize the value of information in the internet, we have to ask ourselves, are we ready for a neoliberal type of a system today in which is not transparent or accountable to the citizenship? And if we're not, well then, are we going to be okay with what the future holds?
Businesses are influencing government policies more and more, which gives less power to individuals and access to resources. That develops another dilemma, is to determine whether individuals who really need education can afford to get a higher education at the cost of being able to try and get a job.
So it's had equalizing effects, and it's had a lot of inequality effects. I think the inequality effects are really problematic, both within countries, in the West, but also to to a significant extent within China itself, and within the re-emerging and emerging countries themselves. It's something that we're going to have to deal with, because inequality produces social frictions, because inequality in and of itself is a negative externality. It's ethically unacceptable also. Fairness and relative equality, I think, is a normative frontier that we have to keep to in our societies.
In many ways, the traditional forms of life, the traditional forms of production, or maybe artisanal kind of traditions that may have existed in a country may have to be completely eradicated in order for them to be competitive in a global economy. It could be that whole policies about agricultural life have to be completely eradicated, that new cities get developed, that people are forced to urbanize. And these kind of changes, it's not so much whether or not the global economy or the international economy for globalization. The question that each country has to ask is whether its people are ready for the effects that it will have. And there's no clear answer, by the way, despite what I guess mainstream economists tend to argue, that globalization leads ineluctably to higher levels of literacy, higher levels of people leaving poverty. It's really hasn't been demonstrated statistically. So I think the question is, to what extent, if you are going to enter into this global economy, which you must do, are you going to be ready for its negative consequences?
The reality is, I think globalization has already impacted the world economy. Okay? And it had some impact on it. It also had some ability to lack of monitoring so that those who took advantage of it. Globalization in and into itself is not all bad if in fact everyone is honest. The ability to find honesty throughout world history always tends to be something that creates a crack, slipping through the cracks. Greed can create a major repercussion for globalization, because if you have too much power in one individual, one institution's control, then the question becomes, are they going to be able to balance it? It's the balance. It's always about balance and moderation. Okay, too much. I mean, there's bigger issues that we have to think about. There's discussions about concerns for water and how water is going to become a commodity. There's going to be issues about fresh air. Okay, weatherization. These extreme, drastic changes. I mean, in California now, we have concerns for a drought. Okay, and then you got to be issues of the land having too much rain at one time. In the East Coast, there's just the reverse, temperatures going drastically from one end to another. So it still comes down to the issue of being able to find a reasonable balance and having it so that those in control of the resources and quote-unquote power, okay, being able to effectively distribute it fairly and equitably.
And today, interests are at the top of that list. And those interests include having enough for me. Look at the phenomenon of land grabs. There's not that much arable land for the populations we have. So who's going after the land? It's not the old colonialists. I mean, a little bit, yes, but mostly it's China, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. It's those who think, yes, we don't have enough food internally to feed our people, so let's go and get the land from someone else.
It's not at all clear that the world ecosystem, the biosphere that supports us, can withstand another increase of maybe another 3 to 4 billion people between now and, say, 2050.
We're a mammal living in a planet with various different species on an Earth that is a living thing, in which we are abundantly taking resources in a manner which is both unethical, non-economically rational, and politically destabilizing.
One, obviously, is the ability of the world's atmosphere and the world's oceans to absorb the pollutants, most importantly carbon dioxide, that we have been dumping into the natural environment over the course of the Industrial Revolution that began over 20 years ago. It's not at all clear that the raw materials necessary to maintain an advanced industrial civilization and to expand the number of people who participate in it are there looking toward 2030, 2040. Where are we going to find the rare earth metals? What grade iron ore will be available? What kind of aluminum? What kind of bauxite? There's going to be a raw material crunch. And alongside that, of course, we're coming up against a kind of plateau in the world's production of conventional fossil fuels. To some degree, that's relieved by the tight oil and shale gas boom here in the United States, but it's very uncertain as to how long that's going to last. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20. So what that translates into as the middle class rises in the global south, and people in India and China can aspire to having a family car and all this other kind of stuff, is a real energy crunch. Now that's important also for world food production, because we have an industrial system of agriculture that depends on massive inputs of fossil fuels in order to produce the calories that allow us to increase the planet's carrying capacity for its human population. We're running into shortages of water, as we exhaust fossil water aquifers around the world. We use to irrigate desert and turn it into farmland. We are running into shortages of topsoil because industrial practices destroy the soil upon which we depend. We're running conceivably into a shortage of phosphate, which is one of the ingredients to the kind of fertilizers that that are essential to this system of industrial agriculture that we've developed here in the West and exported to the rest of the world. So, in addition to these other shortages, there are real questions about food availability. As things now stand, the world's grain surplus is equivalent to about 50 days. But if we have extreme weather events impacting any of the world's major food-producing areas, say Russia, Australia, the American, Canadian High Plains, France, Argentina, then we could get into a situation where international food markets break down, countries begin to sort of turn to protectionist policies. Actually, we already saw that in 2010, when after the Russian heat wave that produced record-breaking temperatures across Russia and in Moscow, Russia suspended grain exports, because they lost something like 30 to 40% of their harvest. Ukraine did the same thing. I think Thailand did that in terms of rice export in 2011, 2012, after massive floods resulted in the loss of something like a third of their grain harvest. Grain prices have gone up following the drought in the American wheat belt for the last 2 summers. In Iowa, someplace in Iowa, which produces 4 times as much grain, say, as Russia, one state, we lost 60% of the corn harvest in certain counties. So what we have is a situation where globalization, the increases in human population, that modern medical technology, modern food systems, modern transportation systems have allowed to occur, are running up against what looks like a set of natural limits.
First, we saw instances such as illegal arms trades, petro deals, or drug trades taking place all around the world in a black market prior to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The irony is, now black markets incorporate a decent percentage of several legitimized core nations' GDPs in 2014. Second, the Cold War did not suppress the innovation of technology. In fact, the arms race and the creation of the internet, using government funding in universities, further advanced our intelligence of technology, communication, and various levels of transportation. This is why I argue that globalization was in full effect during the Cold War and overall supersedes international relations. Otherwise, how else were we able to get a man on the moon?
Just the flood of conflicting views. Individuals don't know what's real, what's fake. You know, we need more independent networks that are by the people, for the people.
There has been a rather wide argument, broad argument, that the state has been submerged by global capital, that global capital transcends the nation state, that the state no longer controls capital flows and no longer can control them, that the state cannot tell corporations where to invest or where not to invest, and that therefore the state's ability to actually deal with social problems and economic problems at home has been significantly curtailed. This is in part true and part false, because the state itself was a major agent in allowing all of this to occur. The American state was a crucial factor in global capital liberalization over the past 30 years, along with the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and the galaxy of private international actors, transnational actors, who participated in private clubs such as Davos, the World Economic Forum, and so forth. The state, the American state, and other states too, the American state these private transnational actors and the international financial institutions constituted a complex but coherent power system, I'm citing Robert Cox, that actually made the globalization phenomenon what it is today. Is the state impotent today? Well, the state need not be. It has made itself impotent in many ways, but it need not be. In the history of capitalism, the state has sometimes favored capital, allowing it to freely roam the world. At other times, the state has reclaimed control and regained control of global flows precisely for the purpose of trying to reestablish certain social and economic and policy priorities at home. This is a balance which changes all the time. Nothing is ever entirely irreversible. But this is one of the major issues. One of the major issues has been, how much can the state now do to solve social issues at home under conditions of globalization?
The financial collapse of 2008 was an industry-wide conspiracy against the American public and the American economy and the American government. The question here is the criminal activities that created the collapse. What were they and how long were they? It has gotten to the point in our financial markets that the mens rea, meaning the criminal mind, is inseparable. It's inseparable from the mind of profit. So we have a system in the United States, a regulatory system, in which does something called a moral hazard. It does not punish those who do the wrong thing, and it provides benefit to those who do it. So we're incentivizing the mens rea. Now, by incentivizing the mens rea, consequentially we're saying we're also incentivizing the actus rea, the criminal act, because only through the criminal act can you be competitive. So what criminal act are we talking about? Well, a lack of transparency, but we're going to put that to the side for right now. The criminal acts in 2008 were the strict negligence and recklessness of market actors to dissuade the information from their shareholders and dissuade that information from regulators. At many times, the regulators were the same culprits because of their inexcused ability of covering up certain criminal activities. So for the essence of briefness here, things like toxic instruments, futures contracts, naked short selling, and things of this nature are parasitic and on the borderline criminal.
There is a growing middle class in some places, like India and China, that is for sure. There is a phenomenon of concentration of wealth at the top of society. There is also an impoverishment of many people who cannot make it and are not going to make it, and these are the people who are not taken in to the globalization process. They have a fixed address, they do not travel, they are not members of what I call the Davos class, the people who are nomadic and more or less have the same class habits, whether they live in China or Paraguay or France or the United States.
So the situation in 2008 in New York is not necessarily contained to New York or to the United States. And it's something that is going to continue to happen. Something that's going to not only continue to happen, but it's going to increase in magnitude. Why is it going to increase in magnitude? Because we live in an era of hyper interactions and globalization. So the activities are not constrained within one geographic region. So the calamities that happen in the capital that's internationally exchanged in one geographical location affects the capital that is exchanged in another geographical location.
What we are witnessing today is a change in the circumstances of operation of the world economy. Globalization changes the circumstances in which the global economy operates. It no longer operates according to the logic of dominant national segmentation. There is no transnational company or no multinational corporation that does not invest in China today, for instance, or in India, or in Southeast Asia, or now in Latin America and Brazil and elsewhere, because that's where most of the growth factors of the world economy are coming from. Apple is an American corporation by name, but Apple's production process is entirely done most of it, there's some parts, most of it is done outside the United States and by factories that are not owned by Apple. There's a company without factories, a firm without factories, like all of the transnational textile firms today are firms without factories. They produce through subsidiaries and subcontractors throughout the world, do not take responsibility for the most part for the conditions of work of these subsidiaries. Those scandals from time to time, such as the death recently of 1,500 Bangladeshi textile workers, forces a reassessment. For the most part, they invest worldwide. This is capital investing worldwide.
So instead of the IMF looking for currency stabilization, it has a different agenda now. So we're looking at a world order that is governed by international institutions that promote a certain neoliberal agenda, for better or for worse. There's good sides to it, and there's bad sides to it. But it doesn't understand, or it's not designed today to understand, the original conditions for why World War I and World War II happened, the original conditions why World War III might happen. And that is we have a floating basket of currencies that are making it increasingly volatile for average Americans, average Belgians, average Iranians to be able to participate in the world market in a secure and stable way. The world market has become much more unstable and much more insecure, even though we have institutions that are supposed to make it much more stable and much more secure. And the answer is, why is this paradox happening? Well, it goes back to 2008. Because the majority of the international financial market, or world order, if you want to call it that, the majority of the international markets, and financial and commodity markets around the world are not transparent, are not accountable, and circumvent the law.
Modern societies, for first world economies to be affluent, they become increasingly dependent on developing countries and an exploitive relationship of those countries. And in the middle is a very small class of people who end up reaping massive rewards in terms of profit.
But I think it's much more relevant to look at the class structure of any country. And the smaller the elite, which is still the case in Africa and still the case in some of the Latin American countries, are going to have much less information flow. The top is going to be very connected. Don't worry about them. And they will have opportunities to travel, and certainly they are on the internet.
So it allows for a tremendous consumption of resources. This is going to further exacerbate inequality. Not necessarily because the resources are going to be more scarce, which they will be, which is a primary issue why things have, a greater cost. But also things are going to be redistributed differently. America is not going to give up its 40% consumption of world energy. It can't, or else there's going to be a collapse in our consumer economy. So where does that lead us? With the developing world consuming more energy, are we going to fight for more energy, or are we going to find alternatives for that energy? Well, ExxonMobil gives over $30 million a year to the American Petroleum Institute, which de-incentivizes diversifying our energy consumption. So what we're saying here in globalization, we're giving multinational corporations more power to de-incentivize our portfolios. We need to make our portfolios, our energy portfolios, our water portfolios, our food portfolios, right? We need to make these portfolios more diversified and more sustainable. And what major market actors, like ExxonMobil in particular, right? They do not want to see a diversification in that portfolio. They want to see a world living in chaos.
The Chinese final assembler is making only about $6 out of that value chain. So that China's actual profit from that is relatively slight compared to the owners of the patents, the intellectual property, which is Apple Corporation. But Apple Corporation is not necessarily, in doing that, doesn't necessarily profit the U.S., the United States, in the sense that Apple, like other major international or multinational corporations, have found ways by which to minimize their tax burdens in their home countries, in their countries of origins, by internationalizing their capital and by investing most of their revenues and profits, by shifting most of the bureaucratic, administrative location of their revenues and profit to various kinds of tax havens in the international financial economy, be it Puerto Rico in the case of Microsoft, or the Bermudas, or the Cayman Islands, or various tax havens in Europe. So yeah, globalization has changed the way in which the world economy has been functioning. It has given much greater power to these transnational corporations that account for 40% of world trade. But of course, it's these transnational corporations that made globalization. And it's the state that created the regulatory frameworks that allowed these corporations to do precisely that. So it's actually it's a process of creation of a new world capitalist economy. The real question is whether in the long run it's sustainable or not. That's your question.
This same economic meltdown from the United States has had a dramatic effect on the markets, currencies, and economies around the world, with Europe feeling the effects more in 2010. This is only a basic example of one type of bubble that exists in the global market today. Future student debt, foreign real estate, and natural resource bubbles must be areas of great concern for all foreign and domestic institutions, large or small. The fact is, the global market is recovering, but not fast enough. And the question is, in favor for whom?
All of the social and medical phenomena that you do not want in a society increase with the degree of inequality. That is to say, the more unequal the society, the more you are going to have both mental and physical illnesses, the more you are going to have suicides, prison populations, obesity, infant mortality, shorter life expectancy, delinquency, criminals, young criminals, drug and alcohol addiction, etc., etc. This is very expensive. This costs any society a lot of money, and since most of them do not want to pay for the people who are thus affected, these people are left to their own devices to a very great extent. The United States is the only advanced country that has a health system which is a disgrace.
In our global world, media is either controlled or constrained by very few market forces. This is alarming to us because in the interest of this new internet era, we're depending upon the access to information. Now, whenever you have market constraints to the access to information, what you're saying is the information is out there, it's accessible, right? But it's not the information that you need. It's the information that you can afford, okay? And this is very enigmatic with our healthcare system. It's not the healthcare that you need, it's the healthcare that you can afford. And who defines what healthcare you can afford? Who defines what media you can afford? Well, the marketplace. The marketplace decides how expensive things are. Now the question is, the marketplace isn't a marketplace when you have 3 to 4 media giants controlling the majority of the information.
I think that you can begin to glimpse the empirical realities of exploitation when you look at some basic statistics, such as looking at worker productivity or hours worked and wages, as opposed to the profits reaped in by any particular industry or particular corporation. And you will see this gap inflating exponentially since the 1980s. That people work more and receive less for what they work. And it's one of the main explanations for why from the 1980s to the 1990s into the early 21st century, you have this kind of, in one way, regression of fortunes for middle-class and working-class families. You know, I mean, in 1980, you could have just one person in the household working and provide for the family. By the late 1980s, you needed both parents going to work, almost as a classic kind of like example of have a middle-class life. In the 1990s, that was no longer enough. So they expanded credit to people, which led to this huge bubble in the 21st century. And now people can't even pay for their basic education needs. Property taxes are increasing. The social costs of living in this society are outweighing the ability for people to actually finance them.
But the last big crisis was in 2008, and that wasn't because of drought or population or anything like that. It was largely because, one, ethanol brought the price of corn up to very high levels, and speculation on commodities, on all of the grains and on oilseeds was tremendous, because as soon as it was clear to speculators that the subprime market was rotten and was going to crash, they got out of that and they went into commodities, and there was 20 times as much cash on those markets as there had been 3 years previously. So it's clear that this was a speculative increase in prices. The statistic I use, that it is one day in March of 2008, the price of wheat went up by 31%. This is not buying and selling between farmers and cookie manufacturers, right? This was sheer speculation. So those people who are thousands of miles away are at the mercy of what is happening in Chicago.
The transnationalization of production has created a situation of competition between workers at world level. Because American workers compete with Chinese workers, who compete with other workers, who compete with other workers, for a share of labor and profit and surplus in the global production chain. Right? This situation of competition puts pressure on labor in all various parts of the world economy, particularly in the advanced industrialized economies. So in that sense, it generates inequality. International trade generates a certain level of inequality. But that is not the only source of inequality. Globalization, not at the source of all inequalities. One of the main source of inequality in the United States over the past 30 years has not been globalization and international trade. The main source of inequality in the United States over the past 30 years, and this has been demonstrated by economists and sociologists and social scientists, has been the reorientation of public policies undertaken since Ronald Reagan, and the neoliberal turn undertaken under the conservatives since Ronald Reagan, and pursued by various democratic administrations to some extent, which have fundamentally changed the distribution patterns within American society.
But every time you cut a tax, the burden shifts lower and lower on the income scale, on the class scale. And that's an irony that's beyond the grasp, unfortunately, of most people. That taxes are the most political, of topics. So what you see throughout the course of the 20th century is the ability of, you could say, an oligarchy, a very small group of extremely wealthy, extremely well-connected, extremely influential people who are able to purchase influence, purchase senators, finance campaigns, so on and so forth, in order to manipulate policies on a whole series of levels that benefit them. And taxes is probably the most important of all. At another level, corporations, especially in recent years, have been extremely effective at lobbying for the reduction of taxes, to such an extent that the New York Times was moved to report about 2 years ago that many of the most profitable corporations in the United States actually have a negative tax rate. General Electric being one of them, Apple and other. There's a series of these corporations that have been able to basically have a negative tax rate. It's unbelievable. And this is at a time when classic public services have actually been cut back. You actually see state universities increasing tuition costs, students being forced into debt. You actually see the reduction of quality of public education in terms of the grammar and high school levels. You see a reduction of quality or the ability for the EPA, for example, to regulate and enforce environmental protection codes. You see a weakening of all sorts of basic public and social goods that once were considered basic, that the tax system would finance.
So what in effect occurred was a massive redistribution of income upwards. They made the rich richer. This change of public policy was designed to do that. It was designed to relocate capital otherward. Rather than the state redistributing downwards, the state, through public tax policy, decided to redistribute upwards. Since people earning more than $29,000, and most of the rich in the United States earned well beyond $29,000 in 1988, you were suddenly paying far less tax than they had been paying in previous historical periods. And that's true of capital gains tax, and that's true of corporate taxes also. Corporate taxes were lowered massively, even as corporate CEO compensations went up astronomically. So not only were corporate CEOs paying less income tax, but the corporations themselves were paying less corporate tax, so that the owners of capital in the corporation, who received dividends, were paying much less tax, not only on their ownership of the corporation, but on their dividends. These things combined created a massive relocation of resources, income and wealth, upwards towards those who already owned capital. That actually is a greater source of inequality than the new international division of labor. The new international division of labor contributes to it. Technological change contributes to it, but the new inequalities, in the United States at least, are fundamentally the result of shifting public policies begun under what has been called the conservative revolution in the 1980s.
The free trade agreements, as they are now called, are not really just about trade. They're mostly about investment, and they are freedom charters for transnational corporations. You know that the proposed free trade agreement between the United States and Europe is a free investment agreement, and what it is aiming for from the side of the United States is to reduce all of Europe's social and public services to private services.
In an economics class, you would learn it as the Lorenz curve, right? So that when societies begin to industrialize, you see this initial period of massive inequality between industrialists and workers, and then the theory is over time that this gap will close. Workers will, their wages will rise, and the inequity between the capitalist class and the working class will begin to narrow off and close. And this was a theory that emerged from the 1950s and early 60s. It's called modernization theory. I think those models are completely off with globalization. And I think there's a couple of reasons why.
In Western Europe, the United States, and Japan, we are seeing a decline in the standard of living, in incomes, and purchasing power, and bargaining power in labor markets for many members of the old working class who enjoyed a middle-class standard of living during much of the second half of the 20th century. So what we're seeing is cooperation between very powerful elites. What we're seeing is a globalization process that has radically redistributed income and wealth upward into the hands of a very narrow group. Right? And this is true in China. It's true in India. I'm sure it's true in many places in Africa and Latin America. So we're witnessing globalization as promoting a global elite, which is all too happy to make deals with each other, frequently at the expense of populations in their home countries.
Post-colonial globalization, which is what we're seeing today, post-colonial globalization is also profiting certain major continental re-emerging states, such as China, India, Brazil, and others, who have become, or are becoming, as the case may be, active units of the world system, which they were not before. And an active unit is defined as a unit which actively transforms its environment rather than simply being transformed and conditioned by the environment. So you can characterize the Wallerstein's system and dependency theorist system of the core-periphery division as one in which the peripheral countries are countries that are conditioned by the most advanced economies. In fact, that's the definition of dependency. It's one of the classical definitions of dependency. There's a mutual relationship there, a codependency, but in which there is an asymmetry of power and wealth, which is defined by the dominant countries. That schema doesn't work any longer as far as China is concerned. It doesn't work any longer as far as Brazil is concerned, really. It doesn't really work as far as India is concerned. It's no longer a north-south issue in that way. It is in some parts of the world economy, yes. But as far as these major re-emerging continental states are concerned, it's not. Rather, what you have now is you have pockets of the North, major pockets of the North in the South, in the global South. And you have pockets of the South, major pockets of the South, poverty, exclusion, inequality in the North, in terms of income and distribution, in terms of wealth. So it's not as if globalization is producing linear effects of north-south polarization. Globalization is producing nonlinear effects, differential effects, according to various parts of the world economy that you're looking at. China has profited enormously from global capital flows in terms of the buildup of its power, in terms of its national power, in terms of its ability to shape its own destiny. At the same time, it's created new dependencies for China. China's growth depends on the American market. American growth depends on China's owning of U.S. dollar treasury bills and other forms of U.S. capital. So it's a complex process that doesn't produce uniform underdevelopment. It's producing development and underdevelopment depending on which part of the world political economy you're looking at.
The high mobility of capital allows capital to be able to jump and follow the lowest wage. It doesn't stay long enough in any particular place to allow for some kind of natural process of growth and wage inflation on the bottom to basically have what is known as a trickle down. So there's an economic reason. Secondly, there's a political reason, which is that wages don't simply inflate. There is no trickle down effect of profits made from capital investment or the exploitation of labor back to laborers themselves. It doesn't work that way. The process isn't economic, it's political. So what happens is you have the emergence of labor movements. Labor movements are in struggle against their employers, and they generally attempt to use the state to mollify the inequality of the income and wealth distribution. That's the story of Western European countries and the United States, for example. I don't think that most countries that are globalizing, if you look at China, if you look at Iran, if you look at with the possible exception of places like India, most countries are relatively authoritarian in terms of their politics. They're not going to tolerate labor movements.
The argument of the neoconservatives and the neoliberals has always been historically, and of classical liberals, in fact, in the 19th century, has always been that inequality reflects merit, that inequality reflects the fact that different people have different capabilities, and this is just the way things are. That the poor are poor because they are incapable of being otherwise, that they are poor because they are lazy, that they are poor because they are unmeriting. And then within the poor there are the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And the undeserving poor are those who are not willing to work and who do not have the capabilities to do any better than that in their lives. The argument, the humanistic argument, which both socialists and forward-looking liberals, some of them in the 19th century, who helped to constitute the social state, the first elements of the social state, argued was that this is not true, that it's social structure that creates difference, that it's social structures that create inequality, that accidents of birth and of condition create the circumstances in which people act and can develop in society, and that therefore you have to correct the circumstances and the social structures rather than trying to correct the individual. So that the idea was that equality was essential, that the state had to play a role in ensuring a relative degree of social equality. And the tension then became between the conservatives and the social democrats and the socialists, the conservatives on the one hand, and many of the liberals and the social democrats and the socialists on the other. The struggle became a political and philosophical struggle between a conservative conception of liberty and a socialist conception of equality, which were not compatible. With the liberals arguing that liberty could not be, that equality destroyed liberty, individual freedom. Whereas the socialists and social democrats argued, in my view quite rightly, that true liberty required collective liberty, that individual liberties required collective freedoms, and those collective freedoms included freedom from want. That philosophical debate has never ended.
Globalization can expose us to other countries that maybe don't have flowing water, maybe no electricity. So if people can understand that these things are really happening and they want to make a difference, they can give up the modern culture way of life with the new cars, new watches, new clothes, and focus more on necessity rather than wants and desires. It's hard to say, but we can do small things and make a big difference.
The issue becomes, where are the resources at and who has access to it? See, there are countries, particularly the African continent, they have a lot of commodities, okay, or resources, but they don't have they don't have the technology to access it. And then there's a bigger issue of distribution, okay, and the ability to be able to refine it. Okay, we're talking about fracking here in the United States. The question becomes: is fracking damaging our water systems? Okay, and are the larger oil companies going to be able to control that factor? Okay, at the risk of everyone else's health and well-being. So I can't speak to the issue of whether it's going to have an adverse effect on it, but I've got a concern for that.
But certainly we have to begin to worry a lot about the outbreak of war between states, I think in the very near future. Right? So I'll be looking at the conflict between Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, and China over the control of islands in the South China Sea, islands that allow the people who possess them to lay claim to great energy and mineral resources. I would be worried about what's going to happen in the Middle East, because the Middle East and Northern Africa, the Horn of Africa, have been experiencing climate change for the last generation, with the result that water has become more and more scarce, desertification is spreading, rural populations are moving to cities, and we can look at something like the Syrian civil war as an example of a climate war, a war that is driven in part by climate change. So populations are going to be on the move. There are going to be very serious conflicts over water resources. As Michael Clare observed already almost 11 years ago in his book Resource Wars, the possibility of war over water is a real issue in the Middle East. It's a real issue between India and Pakistan. And it may be a real issue for the Chinese. It's already, of course, a real issue in the American Southwest between various states and northern Mexico, when we look at the dwindling water resources of the Rio Grande and the river systems there. Right? So, I mean, very soon, in lots of places, we are going to be dealing with absolute water shortages.
All crisis is global now. It is not contained within a geographical area. Nothing's constrained in a geographical area. Even if it is, And that's an ultimate statement, right? Nothing's constrained in a geographical area. I'll explain that. Even when something is constrained in a geographical area, it has the probability to magnanimously affect other things. Now, when we are not prepared for that, that is when crisis management happens, and that's when mistakes happen. The situation, for example, happening currently in Syria or in Libya are directly involved with destabilizations of militias all over Africa and the Middle East. And this, in effect, is creating a lot of migration issues and resource issues to the Europeans, and particularly to these southern Europeans, the Europeans' periphery. Things like global warming. You know, when we combust hydrocarbons, the result goes into the atmosphere. The atmosphere does not have borders. Ebola doesn't recognize borders. Ebola is going to cross the borders of Ghana or not. We cannot constrain a virus. We cannot constrain pollution, nor can we constrain mass extinction. Right? So by 2040, by 2050, the majority of the fish populations, in particular shrimp, are going to be extinct. Extinct within our lifetime. Not because shrimp are diseased or have a predator or anything. We're consciously fishing something out of existence, not because we need it, but because the market needs it, right? So globalization is the only solution to these issues, because the majority problems facing our species, I'm not even talking about governments here, okay? The majority of problems facing us as Americans are global. The things affecting us as North Americans is global.
I don't see a lessening of conflict, although I think the ways it works may be less overtly based on weapons. There'll be more cyber conflict. There will be more relegation of people. You could see it, for instance, in gated communities, but you can see it on a much larger scale of people simply relegated as African refugees are. We subcontract, at least we did, to Libya or to Morocco, keep the sub-Saharans out of Europe, you take care of it, we'll pay you to do it. I think that sort of phenomenon is going to increase. It will be less visible, and it may not kill quite as many people, although who knows. But I won't say I'm pessimistic, because I also see social movements. The kind of people I meet all the time are those who are engaged in trying to make the world a better place, those who are engaged in trying to understand the world and do something about it. So, of course, humans have not finished their history of emancipation and of the conquest of rights. And I think that this is also, there are also many positive trends. But states which we need are less democratic than they were. Even the old democracies have much less, the people of the old democracies have much less control over what their governments do than they did 20, 25 years ago. So globalization has turned out also to be a refuge for some of the worst elements in society and the worst human tendencies. We're not angels, and globalization allows a lot of very ugly behavior to flourish.
So our cities, our major cities, are becoming just these kind of spheres of upper elite society, and working people are forced out to the periphery. I mean, you really see a kind of refeudalization, of society, where it's not just that there's inequality, like your neighbor makes more money than you and you're jealous. I mean, that's gone. Now it's really like, my children can't go to the same school that these children can, and that affects their entire life chances. So what you basically start having, if you look at income mobility, for example, those are the more striking statistics, actually, than whether or not the average wage has increased or decreased, adjusting for inflation. When you look at levels of social mobility, they're incredibly low in the United States, the lowest of the industrial world. And this tells you that you have a stratified, rigidified class system. That the society, in other words, that the class composition of the society just continues to reproduce itself. You don't have a society which is dynamic and people are actually merging to the top. So, and the statistics bear this out. I mean, this isn't an issue of debate. This is a sociological, reality. And it should come as little surprise. It's a winner-take-all society. I have something, and I'm going to make sure that I keep it. It doesn't matter whether I support gay marriage or not, whether I'm voted for Obama or not. I mean, these are political kind of markers of identity that are effectively meaningless when you talk about the social order.
Well, certain global issues have emerged which are not directly caused by globalization that require much intensified international cooperation and possibly even a move towards global governance. I'm thinking of global climate change. I'm thinking of global issues such as hunger. I'm thinking of other global issues such as epidemics and things of this type. But global climate change is, of course, the most obvious one. Global climate change is a pure case of a transnational issue or of a global issue that is not nation-specific. If you emit pollution, if you emit CO2 in France, it has as much effects in Hong Kong as it does in France. If you emit in Hong Kong, it affects Bermuda, and so on and so forth. This is not nation-specific. There are no borders, ecological borders, to CO2 and global climate change. So global climate change challenges the international system, the international community as it has been called, to actually move towards new forms of international cooperation and transnational governance to solve an issue that is not soluble in a national context. The difficulty of that has already been demonstrated, because the world is still segmented in national states and nation states. And that segmentation is there. One can deplore it. One can consider it extremely unfortunate. But the national identities, national political structures, and so on and so forth, which are the core characteristic of modernity, of capitalist modernity, that these structures have proven more durable than many thought. And that therefore we're going to have to somehow have a kind of intermediate system, if we want to solve some of this problem, between global governance, the ideal level of global governance with central global institutions, and international, much reinforced international cooperation, a highly institutionalized form of international cooperation. That in turn requires that the major actors of the world today, national actors, begin to move in that direction. I'm thinking of the United States, I'm thinking of China, I'm thinking of India, I'm thinking of Europe, and so forth. For the moment, there are significant hindrances along that route, but we're going to have to move in that direction.
According to the climate scientists, and this is actually a rather shaky proposition, we have a carbon budget of only 500 gigatons of carbon left. We can only effectively add, we have to keep the amount of carbon dioxide we add to the atmosphere under 2 trillion gigatons. But we've got in it, almost 3 trillion gigatons that are still in the ground. So that means that we have a political fight on our hands with the fossil fuel companies, given the rising demand for energy, especially in the global south, but around the world.
This, I think, is a real source of worry, that one of the reactions to globalization is nationalism. The other is, concerning for me, is religious fundamentalist identity formations. That another reaction has been an attempt to by many world religions, by social forces within different cultural areas, mobilizing religion as a way to as a way to counter some of the aspects of globalization which they consider to be threatening.
The only way for us to address the greatest issues affecting us, not only as citizens, not only us as people in a particular area, But the greatest things that are affecting us and impacting us as a species can only be solved through global solutions. We're facing not only our other extinctions, but our own extinction if we do not change what and how we're interacting. This is how serious this has gotten. The way that we've industrialized, the way that we've consumed, the way that we have interacted with one another on a strict state system, following the Treaties of Westphalia, is no longer appropriate for us to survive as a species. So we need to have global solutions, or else we're going to either face extinction, or we're going to face a future in which is very, very ugly.
I'm concerned that that we're living a moment in world history, a world historical moment, that's pregnant with dangers for civilization. The global economic and financial crisis, rather global financial and economic crisis that began in 2008, and which was not properly speaking an American crisis, but a crisis of global finance, has actually created conditions of instability, social, political instability, in the more advanced, industrialized Euro-Atlantic countries, the outcome of which are difficult to predict. We're seeing growing strains, interstate strains in Europe, growing nationalism in Europe. We are witnessing at the same time the growth of nationalism, of certain sometimes toxic forms of nationalism elsewhere in the world. I'm thinking of certain ultra-nationalist parties in India, the Hindu fundamentalist parties in India. We are also seeing forms of just more classical nationalisms emerge, as in China, where the state has replaced communism with nationalism. That nationalism has become the dominant ideological focus of the Chinese state. And as you know, there are strong interstate tensions now in East Asia because of China's growing claims to suzerainty, if not hegemony, in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea. So we are seeing, I think, globalization hasn't smoothed out the problem of nationalism. Nationalism is reviving. We're seeing a certain kind of re-nationalization of world politics occurring today, which we have to be very careful about. We have to be very cautious to avoid exacerbating this nationalist revival, because nationalism implies, this kind of nationalism in any case implies segmentation, it implies competition, it implies potentially conflict. I don't mean world war, but conflict. Localized conflicts. One can readily imagine conflicts, limited conflicts in East Asia. One can readily, even though they would be very dangerous, one can imagine conflicts in South Asia. You have a very strong Indian nationalism today, which has emerged, which is there. And of course, in the United States, there are very powerful nationalist strains.
It's no longer we have to talk about the end of globalization or reverting to a state of world at war with itself. We have to really seriously begin to worry about the survival of global civilization as we've known it for the last couple hundred years.
I think, globalization as a process that is not mastered potentially engenders the monsters that could threaten globalization, and the problem of keeping up, of maintaining a certain kind of cosmopolitanism, and I would characterize it as social democratic humanism, is one of the paramount concerns of today. To avoid the nationalism, to avoid the fundamentalisms, to bypass them, to give people citizenship and political and social identity, rather than locking them into essentialist and exclusivist national and religious identities.